What dark family secrets were revealed to you once you were old enough to know? Story 1. My mom is married to a meth addict. When I was a kid, there was a particularly turbulent time between them that often resulted in smashed furniture, shouting that haunted my nightmares, and words that were absolutely degrading. I had no idea what their fights were about and grew up thinking it was just about money. Last year, I confided in my mom that my ex had assaulted me, and this truth emboldened her to share hers. Those violent times with her husband? It was because a leaked video had been circulating at her workplace, and the woman in it looked very much like her. When the news reached her husband, instead of protecting her, or even trying to verify if it was true, he believed it immediately and made it his mission to degrade and humiliate her. My mom had absolutely no one to defend her during that time. She knew with absolute certainty that it wasn't her in the video, but she never told her parents, never told us, her kids, because she felt we were too young and she had no friends she could confide in. The violence from her husband, the hushed whispers of her coworkers, the scathing remarks from acquaintances, she carried the agony of those accusations all on her own. A decade later, she was finally able to speak her truth. As much as it burdened me to know that I couldn't have been there for her, it completely changed how we see the world now. The truth will always set you free. Story 2. I had a cousin who died before I or my siblings were born. He was likely killed by his mother's new partner. He was taken to the hospital and died from a brain injury caused by physical abuse. We were from a medium-sized country town. People who worked at the hospital knew our family and said the injuries were definitely from abuse. There was no other explanation. It was horrific to see, but nothing ever came from it. This was the 1970s, and back then, apparently, child abuse didn't happen if the abuser simply denied it. My uncle, the child's father, had already passed away in a truck accident. He was a truck driver, and a car veered into his lane, killing him. I asked how the family could have just moved on in that town, knowing they had never gotten justice. The man who killed my cousin, a 2-year-old, ended up spending over 15 years in prison later on for other crimes. But for my cousin, there was never justice. Story 3. My uncle's death was the result of his own reckless choices. It happened long before I was born, when my dad was around 14 or 15. The story we were told was that my uncle and his friend were riding their motorcycles. His friend swerved in front of him, causing my uncle to crash, break his neck, and die screaming. This hit my dad hard. They had been arguing that morning, and he had said things he didn't mean. Then in his eyes, his brother was murdered. His parents shut down completely. They never dealt with it, never spoke about it, and never allowed my uncle's name to be mentioned. Because of this, my dad, now in his 60s, still has regular breakdowns, having never learned how to grieve. Last year, out of nowhere, my grandmother finally spoke about what really happened. My uncle and his friend had been racing. A steep bend was coming up, and they were riding side by side. The friend slowed down. My uncle didn't. He lost control at high speed, crashed, and broke his neck. He didn't die instantly. He held on for a little while and was able to speak to an officer before passing. Apparently, he left a message for my grandparents and my dad, but my grandmother refused to pass it on. She let my dad believe for over 45 years that his brother had been killed intentionally. Decades of anger, grief, and abandonment. All of it could have been avoided. But she chose not to, because she lost her son. Yes, she lost a son, but in doing so, she destroyed another when he needed her the most. Story 4. In the late 1970s, my dad and his family fled their ranch in Guatemala and came to the U.S. Their ranch was attacked and destroyed by bandits, with a supposed gringo searching for guerrilla-affiliated Maya forces. Thank you, CIA. They walked for 2 days from the Izabal region to the capital, and after learning that my grandfather had been killed, my dad and 2 of his brothers left their sisters behind with their half-brother and set off for the U.S. They arrived in San Diego but decided to head east after a few weeks. They eventually settled in New York, and for the next few decades, they sent money back home to support their sisters. Eventually, my dad learned about the CIA's involvement from a 60 Minutes documentary and decided to contact his brother still in Guatemala. He spent weeks trying to find an updated number or address, but in the end, he had to settle for reaching out to one of his nieces through Facebook. That's when he learned the truth. Their half-brother, after just 5 years, threw the sisters out of the house, but kept collecting the money their brothers were sending. When the new government in the early 2000s offered to return a large portion of their stolen land, hundreds of acres, he cut a deal for a payout instead and secured himself a cushy government job. The darkest part? After being thrown out, 4 of the sisters died over the next 12 years. One was murdered. One was kidnapped and presumed dead. One died from domestic abuse. One was decapitated by an officer. Only one of my dad's sisters is still alive, and she only made it to the U.S. 2 years ago. Story 5. I was always told that my oldest sister and I were severely beaten by my mom and her boyfriend, which is why we were placed in a care home at a very young age. Later on, my dad gained custody of us, but he was also violent. My mom was sent to a mental hospital and was only released when I turned 18. When that time came, I decided to meet her. That's when she told me the truth. My dad had broken into her house, beaten up her boyfriend, and then tried to harm the 2 of us with boiling water. I didn't fully believe her. After all, she had spent so many years in a mental health facility that it had driven her to the point where even holding a conversation with her was difficult. But I asked my grandmother, the one person who had always tried her best for us, and the only reason my dad had even pursued custody. Well, turns out it was all true. My dad broke into the house and beat everyone to a dangerous degree. He managed to convince the police it wasn't him because my mom's boyfriend had a prior arson charge, and in Ireland at the time, a woman's word meant very little. He lived his entire life free, never facing justice, while my mom was locked away for his crime. He destroyed a woman's life and her sanity just to cover up a horrific lie. Story 6. I was almost 6 years old when, one day, we suddenly never saw or heard from my older cousins, 13 and 14 years old, and their family again. 15 years passed in silence. This story also involves my other cousins and my brother, who were 3, 4, and 7 at the time. We were all just innocent little kids, spending time with 2 teenagers. Kids you'd expect to be normal older cousins looking after their younger relatives. Even at 5, I knew my older cousins, S and J, were mean. They bullied us constantly, chasing us with sadistic laughter, playing too rough, hitting us hard, throwing blankets over our heads so we couldn't breathe, calling us cruel names. I remember being called Piggy while they made oinking noises. At the pool, they would throw us into the water hard, hold our heads under, and refuse to let us up for air. Every Sunday after church, in the basement of our grandparents' home, they tormented us until we cried. And when we finally ran upstairs sobbing, ready to tell, they would immediately switch, acting nice, playing normal games like hide-and-seek, tag, or watching Nickelodeon. They manipulated us into forgetting the bad. On the rare occasions they were almost caught, they always had an excuse ready. The adults would thank them for dealing with our crying, never realizing the truth. This cycle of abuse went on for 2 years. Then one Sunday, when I was almost 6, I noticed my cousins weren't there. I didn't think much of it and kept playing with the others. But soon after, my parents took my brother and me to an office. Small, white, with stuffed animals everywhere. I didn't know at the time, but it was a police detective's office. A man and a woman asked me questions about my cousins. I was terrified of getting in trouble, so I barely spoke. They gave me a stuffed teddy bear, and after that day, it was like an unspoken rule in the family. We never talked about it again. It turned out my oldest cousin, A, who was almost 8 at the time, had finally spoken up. She told her mom everything, but what those 2 did to her was far worse than what we endured. While they tormented us as a group, they took A separately into the closet every single Sunday. At 5, I had thought they were just picking on her. I had no idea they were abusing her. For 2 years, S and J were sick, twisted teenagers. Both were sent to juvenile detention. My uncle refused to believe his sons had done anything wrong, and the family was torn apart. My grandfather banned them from ever stepping foot in the house again. We lost all contact. Through whispers in the family, we learned what happened to them over the years. They both struggled with severe mental health issues. The older one, S, completely lost his mind. He hears voices and needs constant care. He behaves like a child, and I can't help but think guilt slowly ate away at him over the years. The younger one, Jay, also had his share of trouble, jail time, mental health struggles, but somehow he managed to hold a steady construction job and build a life for himself. Maybe because he was the younger one, dragged into it by his older brother, seeking approval. Looking back, I realized there were things we didn't understand at the time. The drawings they taught us to make were inappropriate. My brother admitted that he thought he was going to drown when they held him underwater. One of our male cousins, who was also a victim, developed severe behavioral issues as a teenager. I can't help but wonder if they were connected. For me, it was the name-calling and the suffocation under a tightly wrapped blanket that left the biggest scars. I didn't know all the details until I was 16. My cousin A, the one who suffered the most, finally told me everything. I was shocked to my core. Then in 2019, at my great-grandmother's 100th birthday, I saw them. After 15 years, they were suddenly there. No one in the family wanted to miss such an occasion, and none of us had been warned they would be there. Thankfully, A had moved far away and couldn't attend. If she had, it would have been a disaster. Talking to them again was surreal. S was completely gone, mentally. There was no real conversation to be had with him. But J was different. We made small talk, carefully avoiding the past. At the very end of our conversation, I looked him in the eyes and said, "I forgive you." The shock on his face, the way he stammered, seeing his reaction was satisfying enough. I walked away, feeling unexpectedly at peace. He avoided me for the rest of the night. It was the closure I never thought I would get. Story 7. There's a lot that's shocking about my grandfather. Things I only learned by eavesdropping on my mom and aunts. His first marriage was to an underage girl, though he claimed he thought she was 18. They had 3 kids together. Then one day she turned on the gas in the oven and tried to take her own life, and their children's. He got home just in time and stopped her. Afterward, he and her family decided the best course of action was for her parents to raise the older 2 children as their own, and for her to continue living in their home as their older sister. My grandfather took the baby, and soon after married my grandmother, who raised the child as her own. But my grandmother wasn't the only one in love with him. So was my great-aunt, even though she was already married. I always assumed my grandmother was his favorite since they had 4 kids together. And later in life, when she passed away from breast cancer, he eventually married my great-aunt. That much I had expected. What I didn't expect was to find out that he had been unfaithful before and during my grandmother's illness. That revelation was the most shocking to me personally. Oh, and before all of that, I once saw a sign near my middle school principal's office with a picture of my great-uncle, alerting the community that he was a registered S offender. I had never even met him. Apparently, a neighborhood girl had accused him of luring her into his shower. His grandchildren went to the same school as me. Story 8. I am one of the only people in my family who knows this. My grandparents were married for over 50 years. They had 5 children, 3, then 1, who passed away at age 3, and then another child. My grandfather had a best friend named Uncle Steve. They had known each other since childhood, and my grandfather always looked after him, even into adulthood. Uncle Steve had his own bedroom in their house. My dad even called him Uncle Steve. But Uncle Steve was the father of the child who died at 3 years old. He and my grandmother had a very brief affair. My dad remembers Uncle Steve moving out around the time the new baby was born. But he always thought it was just because there was a new addition to the family. He also remembers Uncle Steve coming by once a week, standing at the garden gate while my dad's paternal grandmother carried the baby down for him to see. To my dad, it just seemed like a normal visit. The child had health issues similar to Uncle Steve's, only more severe. In the end, he passed away from a heart defect. My dad still remembers the day of the funeral. Uncle Steve, who had been kept away for years, was finally allowed back inside. He sobbed uncontrollably, and my grandfather hugged him. After that, everything seemed to be forgiven. Uncle Steve moved back in, but he had to leave whenever my grandfather went on trips. Years later, when my grandfather passed away, Uncle Steve and my grandmother lived together for the last 2 years of her life. When she died, he continued living in the house alone for another 6 months before he, too, passed away. My dad pieced it all together over time, but his siblings have no idea. He told me that he and I need to take this secret to the grave. It's just a strange, sad story for everyone involved. Story 9. This isn't exactly dark, but when I was in grade school, my parents went on vacation for a NASCAR race, leaving me with my grandparents. When they got back, I overheard snippets of conversations about my dad being arrested. I asked what for, and they told me it was for smashing a bunch of Oreos on a picnic table. Weird, but okay. Apparently smashing cookies is illegal in Delaware. It was a big deal at the time because my dad had to miss more work to make the 8-hour drive back for his court date 2 weeks later. When I got older, I finally learned the full story. They had been staying at a state park, and if you've never been to one, They have strict quiet hours, no loud noise after 9 or 10 p.m. Well, at around 11:30 that night, my dad and his friends were drunk. One of them climbed onto the picnic table, started stomping on Oreos, laughing and yelling. That's when the state park police showed up to tell them to quiet down. Unfortunately, my dad's other friend had left his weed and a pipe sitting out on the table. Since the campsite was registered in my dad's name, he got charged too. They were locked up overnight until they could see the judge. 2 weeks later, they all had to go back for court, where the charges were dropped. Story 10. Growing up, I never questioned why my dad always went to meetings on Sundays for work, why most of his friends seemed kind of sketchy, though they were always nice, or why he had some strange scars. Then I got older and learned the truth. My dad had a 20-year cocaine and drinking problem. All of his old friends had been drug dealers, and those scars? They were from all the drunk and high car accidents he had been in, or from that time he stabbed himself when my mom threatened to leave with my sister. She didn't, and they're still married to this day. Over time, I learned even more stories, like why our close family friend Norman got deported back to Jamaica, or why so many of my dad's friends struggled to get steady jobs because of their criminal records. Everything tied back to the cocaine and alcohol. But the messed up part? My dad was at the center of a lot of it, yet he never got arrested. Not even once. Most of his friends who were black spent time in jail, while he, a white man, walked away every time. That's why, now that he's successful and retired, he does everything he can to help them. Even before he retired, he gave money to his old friends, helped them get jobs, and helped with their mortgages, rent, and leases. He knows he got lucky, and he's trying to make up for it. Story 11. I don't know many details, but my grandfather murdered someone at a lake in Arizona in the 1950s. He shot a man and was later arrested for it. However, at some point, he was released on bail. Before the trial could happen, the two men who had been with the victim at the lake, his friends who had witnessed the incident and were set to testify against my grandfather, both mysteriously turned up dead. With no witnesses left, the charges were eventually dropped, and my grandfather went on to live his life until he passed away in 2011. He was a tough, old-school Texas man, a military veteran who struggled with alcohol for many years before quitting in the early 90s. To me, he always seemed strong, tough, but ultimately a good man. I admired him and cherished the time I spent with him as a kid. He openly favored me, calling me his only grandkid with any backbone, and that meant a lot to me. But he always had guns everywhere. He slept with a shotgun mounted above his bed and another one underneath. In the years leading up to his death, he developed dementia and became increasingly violent and paranoid, convinced that people were coming for him. None of it made sense, until he died and my mom finally told me about the murders. I think the guilt haunted him for the rest of his life. In the end, almost no one mourned his death. No one except me. Story 12. I don't know how true this is. It sounds like a complete lie, but at the same time, it's oddly believable. I was told that my dad's father, a very well-known doctor in Sri Lanka, discovered a cure for asthma while researching treatments for something else, roughly 30 or more years ago. He tried to submit his findings to the appropriate medical authorities, but either he wasn't given credit or they refused to name the medicine after his family. Out of pride or spite, he decided to keep it a secret and took the knowledge to his grave. My dad told me this when I was about 16. At the time, I thought my grandfather was justified. I mean, that's how the story was presented to me. But when I brought it up again years later, this time openly frustrated with my grandfather's choice, my dad just looked ashamed and brushed me off. Story 13. This one took me years to put together. When I was younger, I found love letters addressed to my mother from a man named Pete. In them, he reminisced about their time together in college at LSU, mentioning how much he cherished their relationship. He talked about her attending his basketball games in the early 70s and how he had always been afraid that his main girlfriend would catch them. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Later, I remembered an argument my parents had when I was younger. My dad had caught my mom with a tall guy in a car just before they got married. She insisted it was just an old college friend and shut the conversation down immediately. That memory hit differently when I started thinking about the letters again. My mom was 5 feet 9 inches with red hair, and my dad was 6 feet 0 inches with dark hair. No one in my family was particularly tall, and there were no blondes on either side. Meanwhile, I'm 6 feet 7 inches, blonde, and better at basketball than anyone else in my family. When I rediscovered the letters after my mother got sick, I read them more carefully. The truth became clear. Pete was Pistol Pete Maravich. His letters frequently mentioned basketball, and two of them were dated after I was born. Their tone was different. One asked how the situation was, and the last one said he wished things were different, but that, given the circumstances, they should never talk again. He ended by saying it would be better for everyone. Now that both my parents have passed, I bought a 23andMe and an Ancestry DNA kit, but I still can't bring myself to send them in. Story 14. My maternal grandfather had a brother who didn't look like anyone else in the family. When I was a teenager, my mom casually mentioned that he had actually been taken in by my great-grandmother as a baby. Apparently, she had been waiting to board a train when she noticed a young woman holding an infant, pacing nervously up and down the platform. My great-grandmother approached her and learned that she had given birth out of wedlock. She was returning home after being away for some time, and before boarding that train, she needed to get rid of the baby. My great-grandmother didn't hesitate. She took the child home. By all accounts, he grew into a wonderful man, deeply grateful for the life he was given. He knew the truth and never stopped thanking the people who had saved him. My grandfather loved him dearly. A wild story, but ultimately it had a happy ending, at least for him. Story 15. I grew up with a father who was both an alcoholic and a drug addict. Last year, my mom finally opened up about some of the things he had done to us. We never really had a relationship because he was never a good dad. But my mom still tried to protect me from the worst of it. I had no idea how bad things really were. For a few years, we had to live on the run from him, moving from hotel to hotel, trying to stay safe. When I was little, I didn't understand why we were always staying in different hotels. I just thought it was fun and exciting. But there was one particular day that changed everything. My mom was on her way home when she got a call from my dad's best friend. He warned her that my dad was waiting for her inside the house and that he was planning to do something terrible. Panicked, my mom immediately called the police and was escorted to a friend's house for safety. The next day, when the police checked the house, they discovered that all the phone cords had been cut and the phones had been thrown into the yard. My mom is convinced that he was planning to kill her. Finding out about all of this recently has been incredibly difficult, but I'm working through it. At least now I know the whole story. I will never forgive my dad for what he tried to do, and I will never look at him the same way again. Story 16. My family has many secrets, but I'll share the ones that shocked me the most. The mother of my grandfather, my dad's father, was an important figure in a Mexican cartel. That's all I know, and honestly, I don't want to know more. We distanced ourselves from that side of the family to avoid getting caught up in that dark history. We want nothing to do with that kind of life, and we don't want any problems. The second secret, which is even more disturbing, is that my grandmother, my mom's mother, used to give some of her children away as gifts. My mom told my brother and me about it just once. She believes there were originally 12 children, but my grandmother only kept 8 of them, most of them from different fathers. I don't judge my grandmother. I love her, and what happened is not my problem or my mom's. We have no idea where those missing uncles are. I've never met them, but we know about 2 of them because we found them on Facebook. Story 17. I don't know if these are dark family secrets that were kept from me, or just the dark truth behind my dad's death. Things I was either unaware of or had repressed. I don't remember much from my childhood in general, partly due to repression and partly because I started messing myself up from a young age. After my dad died, I was practically raised by my uncle and his wife. But before that, I lived with my mom, her awful excuse of a boyfriend, and my sister. My parents were divorced, and I don't have any memories of them together since I was just an infant. It wasn't until I was an adult that I found out the divorce happened because my mom had cheated. My sister was the result of that affair, but my dad never treated her differently. He loved her just as much as he loved me. My mom, however, did everything she could to keep my dad from seeing us, almost as if she was punishing him for divorcing her. My sister and I eventually stayed with my dad for 2 years after I discovered that my mom had been lying about me having ADHD and had put me on Adderall just because I was a happy kid. Around the same time, I also found out that my mom's boyfriend had been sexually assaulting my sister, something I only learned about as an adult. Then my dad hung himself. I was 14 at the time, and no one explained anything to me until years later. I found out that he had been smoking 4 packs a day, had developed cancer, and never told us. He couldn't afford both chemotherapy and my therapy at the same time. He was a great man. His death destroyed me, pushing me into addiction. Not long after, I was forced to go back to my mom, and she ended up kicking me out. It was my uncle who got me off the streets and helped me turn my life around. He and his wife were shocked by how little I knew, how much I had either been kept in the dark about or had blocked out. I always resented my mom, but I never truly realized how terrible she was until later. My sister had begged her for help, had cried to her repeatedly, but she never believed her. My mom killed my dad, not in the literal sense, but she destroyed him. Through their marriage, their divorce, the custody battle, and just in life in general. And I hate her for it. Story 18. None of this was explicitly hidden from me, but I didn't realize just how messed up one branch of my family was until years later, when I finally put all the pieces together. My grandfather's father was killed on D-Day, yet one of my grandfather's brothers was born in 1946. I never knew exactly how old he was, but when I did the math, it suddenly made sense why he was rarely around. Growing up as the illegitimate son of a war widow in a strict religious community must have been rough. Another brother had 3 kids. One died of alcohol poisoning. Just a few months later, another died by suicide. The third one ended up living with my parents for a while, though I never knew why. I only figured it out later, and from what I've gathered, he was deep into drugs. Last I heard, he was still out there somewhere, wandering around in that same state. That great uncle, the one who lost all 3 of his children in one way or another, died in his late 50s or early 60s from liver failure caused by years of alcohol abuse. It's honestly a miracle that my grandfather was able to keep his life in order, and that my mother, my aunt, and all 5 of us grandkids turned out to be fully functional adults. Story 19. When I was less than a year old, my grandmother, on my mom's side, had written in her will that each of her grandkids would receive an equal portion of her life savings when she passed. She died just before my first birthday, and as a result, I was granted about $10,000 in inheritance, which was locked in an account until I turned 18. That was the story I was told growing up. But here's the real story, the one I didn't learn until adulthood, after reconnecting with my older sister. Around the time I was born, my mother had been trying to gain control over the inheritance funds set aside for each grandchild. My grandmother had already made it clear that none of her own children would receive a cent, which initially surprised me. But what shocked me even more was that my grandmother's original plan had been to restrict the money solely for college tuition. Shortly after I was born, my mother managed to gain partial control over the will. Against my grandmother's wishes, and without her knowledge, she altered it so that each grandchild could do whatever they wanted with the money once they turned 18. Then came the really eerie part. At the time, my grandmother was living alone in a duplex that had a hot tub in the basement. She was also a heavy drinker. One day, she called my mother and my aunt to help her move some furniture. This happened shortly after my mother changed the will. According to their story, when they arrived, no one answered the door. Using a spare key, they let themselves in, only to find their mother upside down in the hot tub, drunk. According to the police, she had been intoxicated, fallen in, and drowned before she could get help. But according to the paramedics, she hadn't been dead for very long before they arrived. The timing was unsettling, almost too close. If she had drowned by accident, it would have meant she was actively drowning at the exact moment my mother and aunt were at the door. Or something else had happened. The circumstances were suspicious. Given the complicated history between them, and the fact that my mother has always avoided talking about her own family, especially her mother, it's hard not to wonder if something more sinister was at play. Maybe they did it to ensure their children got their inheritance. Maybe it was out of spite because they weren't included in the will. Either way, it's chilling, and it makes me glad I don't speak to my mother anymore. Story 20. I'm a quarter Dutch, but most of my Dutch relatives live in a different state from the rest of my Australian family. One day, while hanging out with my cousins and aunt, I casually asked, "Why do we live here if everyone else is in the other state?" The answer surprised me. It turns out that the Dutch side of my family is almost like a cult. They follow Catholic apostolicism, where apparently all the men are priests. They're very selective about who gets to be part of the family, and that's why my side moved away. It all started when my Oma, Dutch grandmother, left with her husband, leading to the birth of my mom and her 2 sisters. Even though she physically left, Oma never really cut ties. She kept her religious beliefs and maintained contact with the rest of the family. And that's when I learned she had far more influence than I ever realized. I had always thought of her as a simple housewife, but she wielded more power than that. About 20 years ago, one of my aunts was living in England with her new husband. The reason? The Dutch side of the family didn't approve of him. Tired of the judgment, they left. But it wasn't long before my Oma intervened. She bought them a house loan in Australia and sent plane tickets, guilt-tripping them into returning. A year later, I was born. And guess what? My parents got the same deal. A house loan meant to be paid off over time. Neither marriage lasted. My aunt believes that if she had stayed in England, she'd still be married. As for my parents, they simply weren't a good fit, and having a looming house loan didn't help. And so here we are, an Australian family 1,000 kilometers away from the rest of our relatives. My grandparents are fine, and each of their kids has moved on in their own way. I guess it's just something they have to live with. But hey, at least I got the Germanic height. Story 21. My maternal grandfather wasn't actually my real grandfather. Turns out my maternal grandmother had quite the wild past and was involved with multiple men. Out of her 5 children, including my mom, the 2 youngest were fathered by different men. I never met my biological grandfather and likely never will. That also means I have biological aunts, uncles, and cousins out there that I'll probably never know. But honestly, that's a good thing. The man I thought was my grandfather suffered from Huntington's disease, a devastating degenerative neurological disorder that turns people into something unrecognizable. It's genetic and has a high probability of being passed down. All of my mom's older siblings inherited it, and they're completely unhinged and mean. But my mom didn't get it. Neither did her younger brother, different fathers. As if that wasn't enough, my not biological grandfather ended up killing his second wife after divorcing my grandmother. He was also openly racist and a card-carrying member of the KKK. So, in a twisted way, I'm grateful that my grandmother was unfaithful, because I dodged a bullet. Story 22. I was around 7 when a lot of drama started surrounding my uncle. My parents told me he was sick and in the hospital. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I do remember that during this period, he sent my sister and me a teddy bear that played the Teddy Bear's Picnic song. I just assumed he was being nice while stuck in a hospital bed. Years later, I learned the truth. He had actually attempted to hang himself after discovering that his wife had been cheating on him and was planning to leave him for the man she had been involved with. They had met on one of those early internet chat sites and had been talking for years. Eventually, their relationship evolved into something more. Whether it was purely emotional or physical, I'll never know. But what I do know is that she finally decided to say screw it and ran off with him. My uncle had always seemed like such a quiet, mellow guy, so hearing this shocked me. It completely changed the way I looked at my aunt. We weren't exactly close before, but after learning what she had done, I had no desire to maintain any contact with her. Her children, on the other hand, still seemed to keep in touch with her. She's still with the guy she left him for. My uncle eventually moved on, found someone new, and even had another child a few years ago. He seems happy now. I still wish I could find that bear, though. Looking back, it feels like his way of doing something kind in the middle of his pain. Story 23. Communist Romania, 1972. My grandmother was pregnant with her 4th child. She already had 2 sons and a daughter, and since conditions were tough, especially in the countryside, my grandparents simply couldn't afford another mouth to feed. By that point, abortion would have been the only option. But in October 1966, the Romanian Communist Party passed Decree 770, which outlawed and criminalized all contraceptive measures and abortions in an attempt to boost the country's birth rate. The penalties were severe. This decision forced many women, including my grandmother, to desperate measures. It also led to the rise of an illegal abortion market. The procedure itself depended on how much money someone was willing to spend. The less fortunate resorted to homemade methods, using rudimentary tools like wires and hose, often relying on prayer. Others with more money could pay a doctor to do it secretly. Getting caught meant years behind bars or worse. At the time, my grandfather worked in the military where he had made connections, including a military doctor who was willing to perform the procedure in exchange for money. It was decided they would meet at the military base in the evening. However, shortly after they arrived, the doctor received an urgent call and had to leave for an accident site. The abortion was rescheduled for the next evening. Under immense pressure, my grandmother made a last-minute decision to visit her mother, my great-grandmother. She was deeply religious, which was already frowned upon by the communist regime, and a devoted supporter of Romania's last king, who had been forced into exile after the rise of communism. That night, my grandmother confided in her, and after hours of conversation, she changed her mind. She decided to have the baby, the child who would later become my mother. Another daughter followed after her. My great-grandparents helped raise the children as best as they could. Had it not been for that unexpected accident, my mother and I wouldn't be here today. It is estimated that over 35,000 women died due to botched illegal abortions. Since the procedure was outlawed, seeking medical attention afterward often meant arrest or being left to die in silence. Story 24. Buckle up because this is one wild family secret. When my husband and I got married, we moved several hours away. On one of our visits back home, we stopped by my sister's house before heading out. I don't remember exactly what was said, but I jokingly responded with, "Incest is best. Keep it in the family." A well-known Rocky Horror Picture Show audience participation line, popular in our area because of its long-running live show. My sister froze and said, "So I guess you do know about that then?" I had no idea what she was talking about. She then spent the next 3 hours filling me in. We used to live in California near my aunt, uncle, 3 cousins, and maternal grandparents who are now deceased. I had always known that my father refused to let my uncle visit us in our new state, but I never knew why. Turns out, when their eldest daughter got into drugs and started making poor life choices, she, as an adult, confessed to my aunt that my uncle, her own father, had been sexually abusing her for years. At first, my aunt didn't believe her, but then their youngest daughter also came forward. All 3 daughters were adults when they finally spoke up. My aunt left my uncle and filed for divorce. But a few years later, after he found religion and begged for forgiveness, she took him back. Not only that, she encouraged the daughters to reconcile with him. 1 did, 2 refused. That was just the tip of the iceberg. I started digging, asking other family members, including my mother. That's when I learned that my uncle had once attempted to rape my grandmother. He had lured her into a situation, but she saw the warning signs and escaped in time. He had also acted inappropriately around my mother, and to a lesser extent, around me and my siblings, though nothing physical had happened. And then there was his father, who was praised for taking care of his mentally disabled daughter instead of putting her in an institution. Except she had 2 children, and they were his. So why didn't anyone talk about this? Because back then, even with solid proof, no one talked about these things. Fast forward several years. Eventually, almost everyone in the family cut off my aunt and uncle, for obvious reasons. Everyone except my mother, who kept saying, "She's my only living relative," despite the fact that my aunt had always treated her horribly. Then one night, my aunt called in a panic. She didn't know what to do. She had tried to use her own computer, but it wasn't working, so she opened up my uncle's laptop instead. That's when she found childography. It took her a week to decide what to do. She finally turned him in, and when authorities raided their house, it became clear that she had either willfully ignored what was happening or hadn't used half the rooms in the house. Because it turned out to be the largest cache of child pornography ever seized in California, it made national news. But here's the kicker. Despite claiming for years that she had divorced him, she never actually did. It was all a ploy to make people forgive him and let him back into their lives. On top of that, my uncle was a registered gun dealer. But when they raided the house, they also found a massive stash of illegal, unregistered firearms. No one knows why he had them, other than the fact that he was a horrible gun dealer and an even worse human being. He pleaded guilty and got sentenced to 60 years for the child porn and the illegal weapons. My aunt swore up and down that she had nothing to do with it. Fast forward again. A few years later, my uncle was released early on a compassionate release because he had been diagnosed with a terminal illness. That's bad enough. But what's worse is that one of his daughters, the one he had definitely abused, fought for his release and even let him move in with her. There was just one problem. He was a registered sex offender, and she had a 13-year-old daughter living with her. Since legally he wasn't allowed to live with a minor, she moved her husband and daughter out just so her father could live there. Why? Money. He promised her all his money and pensions if she did this for him. She believed him, and she believed her mother when she said they had been legally divorced. Then he died. And of course, it came out that they had never actually filed for divorce. Not even once. Everything had been orchestrated so that he would have a place to stay after being released. This kicked off years-long court battles over the estate, with my aunt and one cousin fighting the daughter who had taken him in over who got his half of the money. By that point, we had cut off the entire family. I have no idea how it all ended, and honestly, I don't care to know. Story 25. My mom died of cancer when I was younger, but not when I was a minor. I was 19. We had a very close relationship, something my father and older brother always strangely resented for various reasons. When she died, I was stunned to learn that she had apparently left me nothing. I was pretty much on my own, as I had always been distant from my dad and brother. They, however, went on to live quite well without me. My dad suddenly had money to start a classic car dealership, and my brother moved into a luxury high-rise in Miami, supposedly after landing a job right out of law school. 6 difficult and financially strained years later, I was cleaning out a family storage unit, searching for some of my old belongings from the family home we had sold after my mom passed. While sorting through a bin of my dad's paperwork from his old desk, I came across my mom's funeral file. I figured it might finally hold the answer to why so much money had seemingly fallen from the sky for everyone but me after her death. And it did. My mom had intended to leave all of us equal shares of a multi-million-dollar life insurance policy, but my dad and brother had conspired to cut me out. Somehow, the local bank had allowed my dad to cash all the checks meant for us, and he split my portion with my brother. In the end, my dad had to sell his business to repay me in order to avoid legal consequences, and my brother no longer lives in that luxurious Miami apartment. I never heard from either of them again. Story 26. My cousin was, or maybe still is, if he's alive, a fairly prominent member of a certain mafia and was one of their most skilled hitmen. He disappeared after the leader of a rival gang was killed, and it's suspected that he fled to South America. He had done so before whenever things got too heated for him. My father isn't really sure if he's still alive at this point, as no one in the family has heard from him in years. If he is, it's unlikely he'll ever return to the country since he's highly wanted by several gangs. Both he and my father were trained in combat from childhood, groomed to become high-ranking members of the mob. But my dad chose a different path, cutting almost all ties with his family when I was a kid. There's also another dark piece of family history. My dad's grandfather allegedly died by suicide before I was born. However, most of the family strongly suspects that one of his sons was responsible for his death. Story 27. I grew up on the same farm in Belgium where my grandfather had been raised, and my parents and grandparents lived there together. He was in his early to mid-teens during World War II and had many stories about that time. He described how the sky would often turn black due to the massive number of planes flying overhead, or how Canadian soldiers would use their stables to rest before continuing east. He even had an old rusty helmet that he used for chicken feed, which later turned out to be a German helmet. Later in life, however, I discovered something shocking. My grandfather had grown up with 3 brothers, not 2. It turned out he had a younger brother who died during the war at just 11 years old. One day, while playing in one of the farm's sheds, my grandfather, his younger brother, and his older brother found an unexploded grenade. There was an accident. It detonated. My grandfather and his older brother survived with minor injuries, but his younger brother was killed. He only ever said one thing about it. We entered that shed as 3, and we left as 2. Story 28. I've told this story before under my old username, but it's been a few years, so why not tell it again? When I was 21, I got into a fight with my dad over something stupid. It escalated to the point where he called my mom and said, "You tell him or I will." A little while later, she called me and dropped a bombshell. My dad wasn't actually my biological father. And even worse, she had no idea who was. Back in the day, my parents had been in an on-again, off-again relationship. At some point during a break, my mom had a drunken hookup. She genuinely thought I was my dad's kid until I turned 13, when they both started noticing I looked nothing like him. The truth eventually came out, and not long after, they divorced. So, not only was I an actual illegitimate child, but I was also the reason for their divorce. My dad and I tried for years to repair our relationship, but it was never the same, especially after his second divorce. Every once in a while, he calls and we try to talk, but he's a bitter alcoholic at this point, burning bridges with all of his children. Oh, and that entire side of the family disowned me once the truth came out. Aunts, uncles, cousins, even my grandparents. Recently, I found my biological father through an ancestry site and reached out to let him know I exist. We'll see how that goes. I'm not expecting much, but at the very least, It would be good to know if there are any family medical issues I need to be aware of. Story 29. This might get buried, but here goes. My paternal grandfather met my grandmother when he was 37 and she was 19. It was only semi-scandalous for the time. Shortly after they got together, my great-grandfather passed away, and my grandfather became deeply depressed and withdrawn, right before his father's will was finalized. That will should have left the majority of the estate and farmland to my grandfather. Sensing an opportunity, his mother, two sisters, and their husbands conspired to take everything for themselves. They convinced a hospital that my grandfather's depression and withdrawn behavior were signs of schizophrenia, and he was committed to an insane asylum. With him out of the way, his mother and sisters had full control over the inheritance. He spent a year in the asylum before my grandmother, now 21, was finally able to sign him out into her care. But by then it was too late. During his time there, he had undergone experimental shock therapy that left his mind fractured. It was tragic, considering he had once been a highly skilled general practitioner who often treated patients for free. When he returned home, he discovered that his mother and sisters had divided and sold off most of the farm. They used the money to build lavish homes and buy beachfront properties. The only piece of land left to him was the rockiest, most infertile part of the original farm, the same land I grew up on. I've read his journals from before and after his time in the asylum, and you can clearly see the change. His handwriting, his thoughts, he was a different man. I only learned about this when I was 24, from my father's cousin, the daughter of one of the sisters. Story 30. I had a great uncle who was known for living in a filthy house that was never cleaned. He had been injured in a farm accident earlier in his life, leaving him disabled. It was hard for him to move around, and he lived in constant pain until he died. Well, it turns out it wasn't a farm accident. My great uncle was caught assaulting his 12-year-old daughter in the barn by his wife. She grabbed a shotgun and shot him in the stomach. When the police arrived, she told them he had fallen on a pitchfork, and they believed her. In reality, they likely knew the truth but chose not to act. Instead, they ruled it an accident. His wounds eventually healed, but his wife refused to do anything for him for the rest of his life. No cleaning, no care, nothing. Since this was a small town in Nebraska in the 1950s, a divorce under these circumstances would have ruined my great-aunt's life and probably forced her to leave the only home she had ever known. So instead, she stayed married to him, making sure every moment of the rest of his life was miserable. She kept a separate bedroom for herself, pristine, spotless, and rarely left it except to eat. She lived under the same roof as him for decades, but in every other way, she had cut him off. When my great-uncle finally died, my great-aunt sold the house and spent her remaining years in Arizona. She had dedicated over 40 years of her life to ensuring that his suffering lasted as long as possible, till death did them part. Story 31. This is probably nowhere near the intensity of some other stories, but it still hurt a lot. When I was younger, I rescued a baby bird. My family didn't know at the time that it was illegal to keep wild birds, but I learned that from our nosy neighbor shortly after what I'm about to tell you, so that's old news. The bird was a blue jay, which has always been my favorite wild bird species. Being a 6 or 7-year-old girl, I was convinced the bird was female because, well, Disney princess logic. We kept the bird in a cage on our deck while it healed, feeding it mashed up bugs and worms. One morning I was running late for school and didn't have time to feed the bird, so my dad said he'd take care of it. When I got home, the bird was gone. My dad told me that when he opened the cage to feed it, she flew away. I was thrilled, believing she had reunited with her family. I knew that baby birds usually learn to fly from their mothers, so I assumed her instincts had kicked in. For years afterward, there always seemed to be a lot of blue jays at our bird feeders, which only strengthened my belief that my little bird had returned with her family. I'm 17 now. It's been over a decade. During a casual dinner conversation, I brought up the bird, reminiscing about the story. That's when my dad finally admitted the truth. He had forgotten to mash up the worms when he fed her, and she died. Story 32. Apparently, my grandma was involved in some scandalous cult in the Fresno area. The leader of this cult was a complete lunatic and a S-obsessed maniac who slept with a lot of the women in the group, which has some pretty disturbing implications. Aside from that, my grandma has some very strong and bizarre beliefs. She's convinced that chemtrails are real, that wearing masks is a government conspiracy, and that Obama wasn't actually American. According to her, he's a secret operative from Kenya whose sole mission was to bring Sharia law to the U.S. She claims the proof lies in the fact that U.S. flags with a gold rim mean military control. So apparently any building with a gold-rimmed flag is technically under martial law, giving Obama the legal power to kill whoever he wants. Oh, and because the hospital where he was born in Hawaii changed its name, that must mean his birth certificate is fake and he's really from Kenya. She also insists she's not racist, but she genuinely believes that equality is a bad thing because according to her, it would just make everyone equally miserable. And of course, she thinks the world is secretly controlled by the Illuminati, who are obviously wealthy elites using socialism to control us all. This is my grandma. Story 33. My mom and my aunt look about as different as two sisters possibly could. My mom has the classic Celtic features, red hair, blue eyes, so pale she practically glows in the sun. My aunt, on the other hand, has much darker features, tans to a deep brown, and has thick, curly black hair. Growing up, their father was always loving toward my mom, but very cold toward my aunt. Over time, they started to suspect they weren't full sisters, but every time they asked my grandma about it, she would shut them down with, "How could you ask something like that?" It wasn't until she was on her deathbed that she finally told them the truth. Her first husband had been cruel and also impotent. She desperately wanted children, but not with him, and biologically, she couldn't have had any with him anyway. Eventually, she had enough and decided to take matters into her own hands. One night, she went out looking for a one-night stand and met a gorgeous Italian man. That night, she got pregnant with my aunt. She only knew his name, nothing else. Shortly after, her first husband died, and she married her second husband, my grandfather, who was much older than her, about 25 years older, if I remember correctly. I think she chose him because he was willing to tolerate her daughter, who she insisted was from her previous marriage, even though she was actually from the Italian man. Then later, she had my mom with my grandfather. She had convinced herself that if people ever found out the truth, they would judge her harshly, so she kept it a secret for her entire life. My mom and aunt understood, but they were sad that she had carried that burden for so long. This year, my aunt was finally able to track down her Italian family. She was nervous to approach them, but to her surprise, they welcomed her with open arms. They were absolutely delighted to discover they had a half-sister. We're all really happy for her. Story 34. My great-great-grandparents gave my great-grandma's first son up for adoption without her consent about 70 years ago. She kept secretly looking for him, even after she got married and had more children. But she never told anyone in her family what had happened until the day her son would have turned 40. That's when my family started searching for him, and eventually they found him. He had become a priest and had no idea he was adopted. His adoptive parents had passed away a few years earlier, and he said they had always been good people. He would always see them as his real parents. Still, he decided to meet his biological mother. The moment they saw each other, they clicked instantly, and it turned into an emotional reunion, full of hugs and tears. My great-grandma was over the moon and said her life finally felt complete. When she passed away, he was the one who officiated the ceremony. Story 35. I've been waiting for a question like this. Here it goes. For context, I remember that when I was around 7 years old, my parents arrived home, already arguing and shouting as they got out of the car. When they entered the house, my dad grabbed a knife from the kitchen and threatened to kill my mom. She was crying so hard, and then he turned to me, pressing the knife against my throat and threatening us both. The next day, it was my dad who took me to school. Since I was just a child, I think I somehow forgave him. I don't really remember. I guess I just forgot about it. I never knew why they had fought like that until last year. My parents got into another fight before my dad left for work. As soon as he was gone, my mom finally told me everything. Apparently, my aunt, my dad's sister, was rumored to be having an affair with a married man and even bringing him into her home. Another sister-in-law heard about it and told my mom. Out of concern, my mom mentioned it to my dad. That's when he lost it. He accused her of being a toxic, rumor-spreading liar. Turns out she wasn't lying. His sister really was involved with a married man. And the worst part? My dad's family just accepted it. They always did things like that, ignoring problems, pretending everything was fine, and never admitting when one of them did something wrong. Story 36. I always knew my great-aunt had thrown herself in front of a train. I was told she was crazy, and that was the end of it. But when I turned 18, I finally learned the real reason why. My sister has fond memories of our great uncle. I never met him myself, so she doesn't like to think of him this way. But here's the truth. My great aunt wanted to stop having children after her fourth, but my great uncle refused to stop being intimate with her, and contraception wasn't an option. They were Catholic, and it was the 1950s. After she gave birth to their eighth child, she couldn't take it anymore. She ended her life by stepping in front of a train. The youngest child was sent to live with my mom's side of the family, while the others were scattered among relatives. I often think about how lucky I am to have access to contraception and healthcare, things my poor great-aunt never had. And I'm grateful that relationships have evolved, that marriage today is more of a partnership rather than the old-fashioned belief that the man is the head of the household no matter what. Story 37. I was in my 40s when my mother shocked me by revealing that, at 14, she had been sent to a home for wayward girls for 2 years. Her strict father, who ruled with an iron fist, put her there because, as the eldest, he felt she wasn't setting the right example. No one visited her. I don't think she even received any mail. This was in the 1920s, and the reform school was in Shirley, Massachusetts. During those 2 years, she learned far more than she ever would have in the Boston school system. The staff at the school saw that she didn't belong there, and they gave her a lot of freedom. They loved her. But none of that changed the fact that her father had powerful friends who had done him a favor by placing her there. Her family was deeply ashamed, and my poor mother carried that shame for the rest of her life. Even her own sister refused to speak to her. When she told me, I was furious. That same sister, who never married, ended up living with us. All that suffering, all that shame, for nothing. My grandfather had come from Italy and demanded obedience. No exceptions. But my mother, she was tough. She turned lemons into lemonade. She was a fighter. I miss her. Story 38. We moved a lot when I was a kid. I mean, 12 different schools in 12 years, kind of a lot. I always thought it was just a mix of things: money issues, job opportunities, my mom's restless nature. It seemed normal enough, so I didn't question it. I was too busy trying to fit into a new school every year. Then in my early 20s, my mom told me the truth. Her abusive ex-husband, the man we had left behind long ago, had finally been caught and sentenced to 30 years in prison. Now that he was locked away, she felt safe enough to explain that we had been running from him my entire life. Every time he tracked us down, we packed up and moved. I had no idea we were in danger. She hid it from us so we wouldn't live in fear. We were aware of some of the abuse early on, but we thought it had ended with the divorce. Then a few years ago, he was released early for good behavior. But before he could fully enjoy his freedom, he was struck by a car and killed. I don't celebrate death, ever. But when I heard he was gone, I felt relief. I don't think my mom ever truly slept peacefully until that moment. Story 39. I'm late to share this, and the few people who see it will probably just make jokes at my expense. But whatever. My dad was 50 when I was born. My mom was 30, his second wife. All I ever knew about him was that he was a hard-working, independent business owner with a drinking problem. But his life before meeting my mom, that was something else entirely. He was born in Kentucky in 1921. His first job was as a bar bouncer, and during one of his shifts, he beat a man to death with a baseball bat. They hid the body and nothing ever came of it. Another time, he nearly beat a man to death with a car crank and ended up serving 2 years in prison at a place he called the Tucker Farm. His first wife was actually his first cousin. They had 2 sons, my much older half-brothers. I grew up being introduced to her as my aunt. Nobody told me the truth about their relationship until I was in my 20s. Both of his sons made terrible choices. The eldest, my favorite, suddenly changed his name and disappeared when I was 7. I found out later that he was running from an attempted murder charge. He managed to stay on the run, but he died from hepatitis, likely from a dirty needle, when I was 19. His first wife, the one I remembered as a soft-spoken flower child type, died by suicide. But my dad always suspected that wasn't the full story. Everyone in this story's long gone now, so I figure it's safe to finally talk about it.